What is up, guys? Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm Toby. I do random things. And today's video is an educational video. Today we're going to be learning about this. What's this, you ask? This is the Saturn V Rocket. Well, this isn't the Saturn V Rocket. This is the model of the Saturn V Rocket. But we're going to be learning about the Saturn V Rocket. So, let's get into it. By the way, I'm reading off a Wikipedia page, so if you want to, you can go find this on yourself if you want to do further research. The Saturn V is a retired American super heavy lift launch vehicle. Most launch vehicles nowadays are medium lift vehicles or low lift vehicles, so super heavy is ton of lift, ton of thrust. Developed by NASA under the Apollo program for human exploration of the moon. The rocket was human-rated, had 3 stages, and was powered by liquid fuel. Flown from 1967 to 1973, it was used for 9 crewed flights to the moon and to launch Skylab, the first American space station. As of 2024, the Saturn V remains the only launch vehicle to have carried humans beyond low Earth orbit. Low Earth orbit is like, I think it goes up to like 250 miles. I may be wrong though. The Saturn V holds the record for the largest payload capacity to low Earth orbit. 311,000, not point, I thought it was something else. 311,152 pounds, or 141,136 kilograms. Which included unburned propellant needed to send the Apollo Command and Service Module and Lunar Module to the Moon. The largest production of the Saturn family of rockets, the Saturn V was designed under the direction of Wernher von Braun at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. The lead contractors for construction of the rocket were Boeing, North American Aviation, Douglas Aircraft Company, and IBM. 15 flight-capable vehicles were built, not counting 3 used for ground testing. A total of 13 missions were launched from Kennedy Space Center, 9 of which carried 24 astronauts to the moon from Apollo 8, December of 1968, to Apollo 17, which was in December of 1972. So that's a brief synopsis of the rocket. Now let's get into the rocket's history. In September 1945, the U.S. government brought the German rocket technologist Wernher von Braun and over 1,500 German rocket engineers and technicians to the United States in Operation Paperclip, a program authorized by President Truman. Von Braun, who had helped create the German V-2 rocket, was assigned to the Army's Rocket Design Division. Between 1945 and 1958, his work was restricted to conveying the ideas and methods behind the V-2 to American engineers, though he wrote books and articles in popular magazines. The approach changed in 1957 when the Soviets launched Sputnik 1 atop an R-7 ICBM, or Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, which could carry a thermonuclear warhead to the U.S. The Army and the government began putting more effort towards sending Americans into space before the Soviets, which was known as the space race. They turned to von Braun's team, who had created the Jupiter series of rockets. The Juno 1 rocket launched the first American satellite in January of 1958. Von Braun considered the Jupiter series of rockets to be a prototype of the upcoming Saturn series of rockets and referred to it as an infant Saturn. Named after the 6th planet from the Sun, the design of the various Saturn rockets evolved from the Jupiter vehicles. Between 1960 and 1962, the Marshall Space Flight Center designed a series of Saturn rockets that could be deployed for Earth orbit and lunar missions. NASA planned to use the Saturn C3 as part of the Earth orbit rendezvous method for a lunar mission, with at least 2 or 3 launches needed for a single landing on the moon. However, the MSFC, or Marshall Space Flight Center, planned at an even bigger rocket, the C-4, which would use 4 F-1 engines on its first stage, an enlarged C-3 second stage, the S-4B, a stage with a single J-2 engine, as its third stage. The C-4 would only need to carry out 2 launches to carry... What? Oh. The C-4 would only need to carry out 2 launches to carry out an EOR lunar mission. EOR, again, is Earth Orbit Rendezvous. Excuse me. On January 10th, 1962, NASA announced plans to build the C-5. The 3-stage rocket would consist of the S-1C first stage, with 5 F-1 engines, the S-2 second stage with 5 J-2 engines, and the S-4B third stage with a single J-2 engine. The C-5 would undergo component testing before the first model was even constructed. The S-4B third stage would be used as the second stage for the C-1B, which would serve both to demonstrate proof of the concept and feasibility for the C-5, but would also provide flight data critical to the development of the C-5. Rather than undergoing testing for each major component, the C-5 would be tested in an all-up fashion, meaning that the first test flight of the rocket would include complete versions of all 3 stages. By testing all components at once, far fewer test flights would be required before a crewed launch. Crewed as in with crew, not crude as in not very well put together. So crewed as in people. The C-5 was confirmed as NASA's choice for the Apollo program in early 1962 and was named the Saturn V. The C-1 became the Saturn I, and the C-1B became the Saturn 1B. Von Braun headed a team at the MSFC to build a vehicle capable of launching a crewed spacecraft to the moon. During these revisions, the team rejected the single engine of the V-2 design and moved to a multiple engine, sorry. The Saturn V's final design had several key features. F-1 engines were chosen for the first stage, while a new liquid hydrogen propulsion system called J-2 for the second and third stage. NASA had finalized its plan to proceed with von Braun's Saturn designs, and the Apollo space program gained speed. The stages were designed by von Braun's Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, and outside contractors were chosen for the constructors. As mentioned earlier, Boeing, North American Aviation, Douglas Aircraft, and IBM. So that's a little bit of the background of the rocket. Launch history. So there's a chart here from the thing I'm reading from, and there's the serial number, the mission, the launch date, and the notes. So I'm going to read all that. Serial number SA500F. Facilities integration. Used to check precise fits and test facilities operation on pad 39A before a flight model was ready. First stage scrapped. Second stage converted to S2. Third stage on display at Kennedy Space Center. SA500D. Dynamic testing. Used to evaluate the vehicle's response to vibrations. On display at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama, which is close to the Marshall Space Flight Center. Or it could be one and the same. I don't know. S1CT. All systems test. First stage used for static test firing at Marshall Space Flight Center on display at KSC. In case you don't know what static firing is, it's basically just igniting the engines and turning them off, seeing if they work, I think. SA501, Apollo 4, November 9th, 1967. First uncrewed, all-up test flight. Complete success. Yay! Jazz hands. Apollo 6, April 4th, 1968. Second uncrewed test flight. J2 engine problems caused early shutdown of 2 engines in the second stage and prevented third stage restart, which is not great. Yeah. Apollo 8, December 21st, 1968. First crewed flight, first translunar injection of Apollo Command and Service Module. And translunar injection is getting in a trajectory to get to the moon's orbit. Apollo 9, March 3rd, 1969. Crewed low Earth orbit test of complete Apollo spacecraft with the lunar module. Apollo 10, second crewed translunar injection of complete Apollo spacecraft with LM. Only Saturn V launched from pad 39B. That was on May 18th, 1969. Apollo 11, July 16th, 1969. The most famous moon mission, probably the most famous space mission of all time. First crewed lunar landing on the moon at the Sea of Tranquility. Apollo 12, November 14th, 1969. The vehicle was struck twice by lightning shortly after takeoff, but not causing any serious damage. Precision crewed lunar landing near Surveyor 3 at Ocean of Storms. That is kind of a fire name. Ocean of Storms, that's really cool. Anyway, Apollo 13. This is probably the most infamous space mission. Apollo 13, April 11th, 1970. Severe POGO, which I think is oxygen stuff, POGO oscillations in second stage caused early engine shutdown. Guidance compensated by burning remaining engines longer. Third crewed lunar landing mission was aborted by service module failure. Apollo 14, January 31st, 1971. Third crewed lunar landing near Fra Mauro, Apollo 13's intended landing site. Apollo 15, July 26, 1971. Fourth crewed lunar landing at Hadley Apennine. First extended Apollo mission carrying Lunar Orbital Scientific Instrument Module and Lunar Roving Vehicle, so the moon rovers. Apollo 16, April 16th, 1972. Fifth crewed lunar landing at Descartes Highlands, named after René Descartes. And he's the guy who said, "I think, therefore I am." Apollo 17, December 7th, 1972. Sixth and final crewed lunar landing at Taurus Littrow. Skylab 1. Uncrewed launch of the Skylab Orbital Workshop, which replaced the third stage, S4B 513, on display at Johnson Space Center. That's in Texas. Originally designed for canceled Apollo 18. SA 514. Originally designated for Apollo 18 or 19, never used. It was proposed for launching an international Skylab. This station would have been serviced by Apollo, Soyuz, and later by the Space Shuttle. The first stage on display at Johnson Space Center, and the second and third stage on display at Kennedy Space Center. The S2 interstage is located at Parque de las Ciencias in Puerto Rico. And all the other ones on the chart are unused. Now let's read some description of the rocket. The size and payload capacity of the Saturn V dwarfed those of all other previous rockets successfully flown at that time. With the Apollo spacecraft on top, it stood 363 feet tall, and ignoring the fins. What? I'm not reading correctly. With the Apollo spacecraft on top, it stood 360 feet tall, and, ignoring the fins, was 33 feet in diameter. Fully fueled, the Saturn V weighed 6.5 million pounds, or 2,900,000 kilograms. That's insanely heavy. That's huge. That's huge. And had a low Earth orbit payload capacity, originally estimated at 261,000 pounds, but was designed to send at least 90,000 pounds to the moon. Later upgrades increased that capacity. On the final 3 Apollo lunar missions, it sent up to 95,901 pounds to the moon. At a height of 363 feet, or 111 meters, the Saturn V stood 58 feet, or 18 meters, taller than the Statue of Liberty from the ground to its torch, and 48 feet taller than the Elizabeth Tower, which houses Big Ben. The Saturn V was principally designed by the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, although numerous major systems, including propulsion systems, were designed by subcontractors. The rocket used the powerful F-1 and J-2 rocket engines during testing at Stennis Space Center. I don't know where that is. The force developed by the engines shattered the windows of nearby houses. Designers decided early on to use as much technology from the Saturn I program as possible for the Saturn V. Consequently, the S-4B 500 stage of the Saturn V was used on the S-4B 200 second stage of the Saturn 1B. The instrument unit that controlled the Saturn V shared characteristics with one controlled by the Saturn 1B. Alright, we've already read about that. We've already talked about that. Now let's read about the mission sequence. The Saturn V carried all Apollo lunar missions, which were launched from Launch Complex 39 at the John F. Kennedy Space Center in Florida near Titusville. After the rocket cleared the launch tower, flight control transferred to mission control at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. An average mission used the rocket for a total of just 20 minutes. Although Apollo 6 experienced 3 engine failures, and Apollo 13 experienced 1 engine shutdown, I'm not sure what the difference is, the onboard computers were able to compensate by burning the remaining engines longer to achieve parking orbit. In the event of an abort requiring the destruction of the rocket, the range safety officer would remotely shut down the engines after several seconds send another command for the shaped explosive charges attached to the outer surface of the rocket to detonate. These would make cuts in fuel and oxidizer tanks to disperse the fuel quickly and to minimize mixing. The pause between these two actions would give time for the crew to escape via the launch escape tower, or in the later stages of the flight, the propulsion system of the service module. A third command, SAFE, was used after the S-4B stage reached orbit to irreversibly deactivate the self-destruct system. The system was also held inactive as long as the rocket was still on the launch pad. Startup sequence. The first stage burned for about 2 minutes and 41 seconds, lifting the rocket to an altitude of 42 miles, or 68 kilometers, and a speed of 6,164 miles per hour, or 2,756 meters per second, and burning 4.7 million pounds, or 2.1 million kilograms, of propellant. At 8.9 seconds before the launch, the first stage ignition sequence started. The center engine ignited first, followed by opposing outboard engine pairs at 300 millisecond intervals to reduce the structural loads on the rocket. When thrusts had been confirmed by the onboard computers, the rocket was soft released in 2 stages. First, the hold-down arms released the rocket, and second, as the rocket began to accelerate upwards, it was slowed by tapered metal pins pulled through holes for half a second. The 4 onboard engines also tilted toward the outside. In the event of a premature onboard engine shutdown, the remaining engines would thrust through the rocket's center of mass. The Saturn V reached 400 feet or 120 meters per second at over 1 mile in altitude. Much of the early portion of the flight was spent gaining altitude, with the required velocity coming later. The Saturn V broke the sound barrier at just over 1 minute at an altitude of between 3.45 and 4.6 miles. At this point, shock collars, or condensation clouds, would form around the bottom of the command module and around the top of the second stage. Sorry. After S1C separation, the second stage burned for 6 minutes and propelled the craft to 109 miles propelled the craft to 109 miles in altitude and 15,647 miles an hour, which is close to orbital velocity. And nothing much happens during that sequence. So, after the second stage cuts off, the third stage burns for about 2.5 minutes until first cut off at T plus 11 minutes and 40 seconds. At this point, it was 1,645.61 or 2,648.35 kilometers downrange and in a parking orbit at an altitude of 118 miles or 190 kilometers and a velocity of 17,432 miles per hour or 28,054 kilometers per hour. The third stage remained attached to the spacecraft while it orbited the Earth and 1.5 times while astronauts and mission controllers prepared for translunar injection. Now let's look at the lunar module sequence. On Apollo 11, translunar injection came at 2 hours and 44 minutes after launch. The S4B burned for almost 6 minutes, giving the spacecraft a velocity close to the Earth's escape velocity of 25,053 miles per hour, or 40,319 kilometers per hour. This gave an energy-efficient transfer to lunar orbit, with the moon helping to capture the spacecraft with a minimum of CSM fuel consumption. About 40 minutes after TLI, the Apollo Command and Service Module, separated from the third stage, turned 180 degrees and docked with the lunar module that rode below the CSM during launch. The CSM and LM, Command Service Module and Lunar Module, separated from the third stage 50 minutes later in a maneuver known as transposition, docking, and extraction. If it were to remain on the same trajectory as the spacecraft, the S4B could have presented a collision hazard, so its remaining propellants were vented and the auxiliary propulsion system fired to move it away. For missions before Apollo 13, the S4B was directed towards the moon trailing edge in the orbit so that the moon would slingshot it beyond Earth escape velocity and into solar orbit. From Apollo 13 onwards, controllers directed the S4B to hit the moon. Seismometers left by previous missions detected the impacts, and the information helped map the internal structure of the moon. Well, I think that's it. I think that's all I wanted to share. So, thank you all for watching. If you want to do more research about the Saturn V rocket, I was reading off of the Wikipedia page, and I didn't cover everything. There's still some stuff I didn't read, but if you're interested, be sure and look at it. And I hope you all enjoyed. This was a different style of video, but I had to. I do random things, of course, but I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next time. Bye!